Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to sign up for this lecture, and for coming along to listen to what I hope is going to be an interesting presentation on aspects of the countryside. I'm going to be talking about images of rural Britain. And I'm going to be talking about what I hope is a relatively original take on those images by looking not at the kind of idyllic images that are often associated with the British countryside, but a contrasting set of images that I think is equally important. I should introduce myself, though, before I get on to that. I'm Professor Tim Hall. As you can see from the slide, I work at the University of Winchester. I teach and research both in geography and criminology. And my background is it's fairly varied in terms of the research and the teaching that I've done. So for the early part of my career, I was, I suppose, an urban geographer. And within that, I was very interested in the images of cities. So I've always had an interest in the ways in which places represent themselves or are represented. My more recent research, though, has been more criminological in its orientation and has looked at kind of crime within the global economy, amongst other things. But for the last couple of years, I've been quite interested in rural areas and the ways in which areas of rural Britain or parts of rural Britain have been represented in recent decades. That's what I'm going to talk to you about today. This is actually based on an article that I published in the Geographical Association journal Geography about a year ago. So it was in the spring 2020 edition. It had a very similar title to the presentation today, After the Rural Idyll. I've also put reference there to an article that I wrote for the online newspaper, The Conversation, which was looking at rural horror and horror films set in the British countryside. And that's certainly part of the set of non-idyllic or negative rural imagery that I'll talk about this afternoon. I'm sure if you don't personally have access to the geographical journal Geography, I'm sure your school will have access to it. So that's a couple of references to this sort of work that I've done. This is a plan of what I'm going to talk about for the next sort of half an hour or 40 minutes or so. And there'll be time for questions after that. So I think the questions come through, the comments section. I can see them. And, so if you've got any questions as I'm presenting, please feel free to ask those afterwards. But I'm going to talk firstly about the idea of the rural idyll in British culture. The rural idyll, as I'll say in a second, is a powerful set of imagery that was attached to the British countryside historically from the 19th century onwards. It's all represented the countryside in very positive terms. Undoubtedly, that was really important historically, but I think many people would argue that the rural idyll is very much how the British countryside is seen until today, really. And I'm going to sort of take issue with that a little bit. And I'm going to sort of argue that actually there's a very different set of images of the British countryside, non-idyllic images of the British countryside, that many people who studied the representation of the British countryside have overlooked. So I'm going to take you through some examples of those. I'm going to talk to you also towards the end about why it's significant, why we should be thinking about and looking at these non-idyllic images and what they can tell us about change that's affected the British countryside in recent decades, broadly since the post-Second World War period. So I'm going to start by talking about the rural idyll in British culture. I'll then say a couple of things about the way in which the countryside is viewed in other parts of the world, and argue that actually it's quite common in other parts of the world for the countryside to be seen in quite negative terms. And then I'll get on to these examples of non-idyllic images of the British countryside that I think have emerged and are actually very, very extensive since the post-Second World War period, but which, as I argue, many people who've studied rural imagery and rural geography have tended to overlook. And then I'll try to draw a few conclusions. So firstly, the idea of the rural idyll in British countryside. The rural idyll is essentially an image of the countryside as it says there, beautiful, natural, unchanging, innocent, and safe. Okay, so really positive representations of the countryside. Now, this idea of the countryside as natural, unchanging, beautiful, innocent, safe, all of those things, has been really celebrated within British and especially English national identity. So, you can think, for example, as it says there, the William Blake poem, Jerusalem, that ends with the line, England's green and pleasant land. So this idea of England particularly being a rural place, and that rural being, associated with a very positive set of identities, is really important in British culture. Now, it's kind of tempting to think that the British countryside has always been viewed in that way, as a rural idyll. Actually, this idea of the rural idyll grew up in the 19th century. The 19th century was a time of rapid urbanization, of rapid industrialization. It was the time, effectively, of what's been referred to as the Industrial Revolution. So a time of great change, and particularly, as I say, a time of a shift of power from the countryside to the city, from agriculture to industry. Now, this was a big threat to the aristocracy in Britain, the powerful landed aristocracy. Suddenly, there was a new set of money in the country linked to industry. So the aristocracy promoted the idea of the rural idyll as a sort of defensive thing. They felt they were under threat by this new class of industrial capitalists. So they promoted the idea of the countryside, much of which was owned by the aristocracy, as a beautiful, safe, natural, unchanging, innocent, safe place. Now, this actually overlooked an awful lot of fairly grim realities in the countryside. So, there was a great deal of agricultural poverty. There was a great deal of enclosure and displacement of people from the land. But that was never incorporated into the image of rural Britain, which was promoted through things like landscape paintings. This is John Constable's famous The Hay Wain. So the aristocracy promoted the idea of the rural image as a way of kind of preserving their cultural power, if you like. This was very successful because actually in the 19th century, new industrialists who are getting very wealthy through industry tended to sort of buy into the countryside and the aristocratic rural way of life. So it's quite common for wealthy industrialists to buy country houses or to build country houses and country estates. So, even though the balance of power economically was changing in the country, culturally, the countryside retained its kind of prominence. And also, the idea of the rural idyll was something in the 19th century that lots of people the middle classes particularly, who are increasingly able to read, they bought into it because they were living in cities that were very polluted and very crowded. So for them to be able to read nostalgic books about the countryside was a way of escape from this very sort of grim urban reality. So the 19th century, the idea of the rural idyll, this positive representation of the British countryside, really took hold. So it was undoubtedly important historically. And it's remained central to ideas of English and British culture since then. And many people would argue that in Great Britain to this day, we still think of the British countryside predominantly as a very idyllic place. Now, you can think of examples like the TV program Escape to the Country, which would tend to support that idea. Okay. What I'm going to argue in this presentation is that always thinking of the British countryside in these purely idyllic terms has led researchers to overlook a range of images of the British countryside that contrast completely with this idyllic image that's come to apparently hold power. And that's what I'm going to explore with you today. As I said, though, I want to just say a few things before I get into the examples from Great Britain of the ways in which the countryside is seen in other parts of the world. So actually, in other parts of the world, it's not uncommon for people to think of the countryside in very negative terms or in ways that contrast with the idea of the British rural idyll. So, for example, the idea of the rural as a place of danger is very widespread and crops up in things, as it says there, like European folk tales. So if you think of Little Red Riding Hood, going into the forest and being, attacked by the wolf, the idea of the forest as a place of danger, crops up in that. You can think of literature. So the great American novel, The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939 by John Steinbeck. This is a novel of the Dust Bowl that affected the soil erosion, the drought that affected many of the southern states of the United States in the early part of the 20th century. The migration of hundreds of thousands of people as a result of that to try to find a better life in California, portrays the countryside, the rural areas of the southern states of the United States at the time as brutal places to live. You can think also of say, American horror films. So the classic 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The more recent, the Blair Witch Project, stories of young, innocent people getting lost in the countryside and coming across these sort of monstrous, terrible figures. And there's a whole variety of films in the horror and adventure genre that kind of follow a similar storyline. So the film like Deliverance, a bunch of city dwellers who go on a canoeing holiday in the countryside that goes horribly wrong. Southern Comfort, a story of some part-time soldiers in America who end up getting lost in the swamps of Louisiana and pursued by the Cajuns through there. This idea of the countryside as a place of danger, very, very different ways of representing the countryside, quite common in other parts of the world. And also, even in with reference to the Great Britain, Karl Marx, when he was writing the Communist Manifesto, he talked about the rural as a very backwards place. He talked about, in the Communist Manifesto, the idiocy of rural life. So if we look to other parts of the world, what we see when we think about the countryside is not this idyllic image, but rather a very negative, potentially a very negative set of imagery. Also, if we look at the ways in which the countryside is portrayed and thought about in parts of the global south, again, we often get quite negative imagery cropping up. So this is the rural geographer, Warwick Murray, talking about the countryside, rural areas in Tonga, so a series of islands in the Pacific. There in rural Tonga, it might be suggested that poor infrastructure, absence of electricity, grinding poverty, patriarchal governance systems, vulnerable housing, environmental deterioration, and marginal and precarious livelihoods characterize such rural places. So, you know, in many parts of the global south, we see the rural presented and thought about as a place of poverty, oppression, and environmental degradation. So we have this situation in the United Kingdom of the countryside historically being constructed and represented in very idyllic terms, but in other parts of the world, very different sets of rural imagery arriving. And as I say, this idea of the rural idyll that was certainly important historically, many rural researchers have kind of assumed that that's still the main way in which the countryside is represented in the United Kingdom. And that's what I want to try and challenge this afternoon by thinking about examples of very negative rural imagery that I would argue are very, very extensive now and are absolutely kind of routine and regular representations of the British countryside. Okay, so as I say, there's a large body of work that's been done by rural geographers on all aspects of rural life in Britain. And within that, there has been a fairly large amount of work that's looked at the images of the British countryside. Now, I would argue that in recent years, there has been an acknowledgement amongst rural geographers that negative, non-idyllic images of the British countryside do exist. So, for example, we've had rural geographers looking at images of rural protest in the media. We've had rural geographers looking at the negative images that came out of the BSC and the bovine tuberculosis crises of the early part of the 20th century. We've had some rural geographers who've recognised specific negative rural representations, like films that might portray negative aspects of the British countryside. We've had rural geographers look at popular music. So Richard Yarwood, a rural geographer based at the University of Plymouth, has looked at the band Show of Hands, a kind of country or folk band, and have looked at the ways in which they portrayed the British countryside, you know, in positive as well as negative terms. So we have had some recognition of negative imagery, non-idyllic imagery of the British countryside that's emerged within rural geography in recent years. However, I would say, looking at this body of work, that what this research suggests is that these negative images of the British countryside are exceptions rather than widespread or routine representations of the British countryside. So there's a sort of suggestion within this research that the representation of the British countryside as a rural idyll is showing some signs of strain, but there's none of this research that looks at this negative, acknowledges this negative rural imagery and suggests that the dominant image of the British countryside as a rural idyll is under threat. So it's always saying, yes, here's an example of a negative media coverage of the rural Britain. Here's an example of a film which portrays the British countryside in very negative terms, but this is an exception. it argues we still see the British countryside in terms of as being a rural idyll. But I'm going to take issue with that. I think actually, if we look hard enough, we can find a large number of very negative representations of the British countryside, certainly since the post-Second World War period, definitely since the early 1960s. And I would say collectively, these negative representations of the British countryside are significant, and they challenge the idea that the British countryside is still predominantly seen in idyllic terms. So a couple of the questions that I'm going to think about in the remainder of this presentation, is there an extensive post-Second World War tradition of representing the British countryside in negative or non-idyllic terms that rural geographers have overlooked? And what's the significance of these images? What do they tell us about the ways in which the countryside has changed in recent decades? What do they tell us about the place of the British countryside within ideas of British national identity? Those are some questions that I'm going to look at. Now, one of the things that I did for the article, and don't panic when you see all of these, which you probably can't read, this is just a couple of screenshots from the article that I wrote for Geography a year ago. And in that, I tried to collect as many examples of non-idyllic representations as I could. And I fairly quickly found there's about 75 here, stretching back to the late 1940s, early 1950s. Now, I don't think this is anything other than just scratching the surface. Since I compiled this list probably about 18 months ago when I wrote the article, I found dozens more examples of negative representations of the British countryside. So I think, there are probably hundreds and hundreds of negative representations of the British countryside out there. And they include film, they include literature, they include television, they include other genres such as popular music and so on. So I'm going to just sort of explore some of the ways in which these representations look at the British countryside. And I think, these images, I've just got the ones from the literature on the screen at the moment, so I'll go and run through some examples, just a small number of examples of films, for example, as well. I think these non-idyllic representations of the British countryside, there's 75 or so that I've collected here, and the dozens and dozens more I found since, I think they're significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think, they're extensive in number. As I say, I found 75 or so here. I'm probably up to about 120 at the moment. And I think there are hundreds more out there. So they're extensive in number. I think these are often also popular and enduring representations of the British countryside. So, for example, the TV series, The League of Gentlemen, a very surreal, dark comedy set in a small rural town called Royston Vasey, which portrayed this village as a sort of bizarre, monstrous place full of incredibly weird characters. That's run for nearly 20 years. It's been on television, it's been on stage, it's been on the radio. Undoubtedly, some of these are incredibly popular representations. And also, some of these representations are culturally significant. So they include, authors such as George Orwell with Animal Farm, Daphne du Maurier. I'm going to give you go through a quote from one of her stories shortly. Graham Swift, the novelist who won the Booker Prize in the 1990s, the television dramatist Dennis Potter. So many of these people have won or been nominated for major cultural prizes. So here are a few examples of some of the literature So it includes there George Orwell's Animal Farm, the Midwich Cuckoos. I showed you an image there a few slides ago. John Wyndham's science fiction novel set in the village of Midwich, which effectively becomes kind of taken over by alien children, and the village kind of falls apart under the terrifying influence of these alien children. And other ones that I've indicated. I'm going to talk about What a Carver, the Jonathan Coe novel, a bit later. So a few examples. Here are a few films, some of which you might be, and television you might be aware of. The image here, the picture is from the 1973 rural horror film, The Wicker Man, set on a remote Scottish island, Summer Isle, where a policeman goes to investigate from the mainland, goes to investigate the disappearance of a young girl, and gets embroiled in this kind of terrifying pagan community. And it ends with him being confined in this wicker man sculpture and about to be seemingly sacrificed for their May Day ceremony. And there were lots of other kind of rural horror films as well around that time, films like Witchfinder General, but also kind of violence films like Straw Dogs, more recently Eden Lake, which portrayed the countryside as violent and threatening, that idea of the countryside as a place of danger again. But even more recent TV series like Broadchurch, which, whilst it portrayed a beautiful setting, it was all about the kind of the murder and the dysfunction of this rural community. So the ways in which these non-idyllic representations display and engage with the rural areas and portray them. I want to look firstly at the idea of the rural landscapes that are portrayed in these particular non-idyllic images. So very often these non-idyllic images portray and focus upon the appearance of the rural areas. We're used, I think, probably thinking about the rural idyll to see rural landscapes portrayed in very positive terms. But if you look at the representations in these more negative images, the landscapes of rural areas are typically portrayed as being grim, bleak, ugly, and isolated. So here's an example from a Daphne du Maurier short story, originally published in 1966. This is a story called The Breakthrough. It's a chilling tale about a sort of mysterious government research facility on the remote east coast of England. A scientist who's trying to find the secret of life after death, and a really kind of very chilling tale. And this is very early in the book, where the story, as the main character in the book approaches this isolated rural coastal research facility for the first time. It's him describing the view that was before him of this rural landscape. The sandy track topped a rise, and there below us, stretching into infinity, lay acre upon acre of wasteland, marsh and reed, bounded on the left by sand dunes with the open sea beyond. The marshes were intersected here and there by dikes, beside which stood clumps of forlorn rushes, bending to the wind and rain. The dikes in their turn forming themselves into dank pools, one or two of them miniature lakes, ringed about with reeds. So again, very, very contrasting to that kind of positive rural imagery that we might be used to. Sometimes these representations, though, do portray the landscape of rural areas in idyllic terms. Now, here's an example some of you may be familiar with, the 2007 film Hot Fuzz. This is the story of a London policeman, Nicholas Angel, who's Simon Pegg, the blonde-haired guy in the poster, who gets redeployed to a picture-perfect village, Sandford in Gloucestershire, a fictional village, a picture-perfect idyllic village. And once he arrives there, what he notices that there's a series of gory, brutal accidents that lead to various people being killed in this tiny little village. And what transpires is that the local Neighbourhood Watch Alliance are so desperate to win the best kept village competition, the national best kept village competition, that they kill anyone who they think is going to spoil the image of their village. So they blow up the house of a local property developer who's building big ugly houses in the village. They bump off the local reporter on the newspaper whose reports are always full of spelling mistakes and who kind of reports on negative stories about the village. They kill loads of the youth in the village because they go graffitiing and spoiling the appearance of the village. So it's the idea of, this desperate attempt to maintain the rural idyll image of this village is driving the local Neighbourhood Watch Alliance to all of these gory murders. And it sort of sets that up as a contrast, the rural idyll image of this village, to the end of the film, which is a really bloody spaghetti Western style shootout. So occasionally the rural idyll is present in terms of the representation of the landscape, but it's often done to contrast to other aspects of the films or TV dramas. Rural communities and rural life is often portrayed within these non-idyllic representations. And the ways in which it's portrayed is often as being boring, small, insular, unchanging, and secretive. So these are how rural communities are often portrayed. One example of this is from the novel The Restraint of Beasts by Magnus Mills. This is a kind of very dark, very surreal comic novel about two Scottish fencers, fence builders, and their English foreman, who go on a macabre fence building trip to rural Herefordshire to build lots of fences. And things just get darker and darker throughout the book. Before they go, though, there's a scene which captures the boredom of their lives in this rural Scottish setting. And it's talking about a night in the pub just before they go, and about this guy Leslie Fairbanks who sings in the pub every week. And it just kind of captures, I think, this notion of some rural areas of being incredibly dull. Leslie Fairbanks had a residency at the Crown Hotel public bar. Once a week, he performed his musical programme entitled Reflections of Elvis to what seemed to be the entire local population. We lived in a quiet place on the road to Perth, and the Crown Hotel was the only establishment you could get a drink, apart from the Co-op off-licence. They came to the Crown to drink, and on the nights Leslie Fairbanks played, they just drank more. This was rural Scotland. There was nothing else to do. Another example of this portrayal of rural communities as being boring and slow and limiting is the true crime book Happy Like Murderers by Gordon Byrne. This is an extraordinary book and a very difficult book to read. It's the story of Fred and Rose West, who were serial killers who killed at least 12 people in Gloucestershire and Herefordshire in the 1960s until the 1980s. And Fred West grew up in rural Herefordshire. And there's a lot in the book about Fred West and actually Rosemary West, who grew up in rural Devon, about their rural childhoods and about the boredom and the isolation of living in rural communities in the post-Second World War period. So this is an example. Fred West had moved away to Hereford for a while. Then he came back to his village. This is some years before him and Rose West started on their serial killing spree. But he moved back to his village for a time in the late 1950s, started work again with his father doing agricultural labour. He found life at home after he came back from Hereford exceptionally slow. He was back working with his father on the farm, rising before dawn to do the milking and roll the urns up the main road for collection. Then silage and mud and milking again at night. What you did yesterday, you did the next day. Changeless and monotonous. 5 Woodbines, that's a cigarette brand, 5 Woodbines and a pint of cider on a wall outside the Walwyn Arms of a Saturday dinner time was all the social life. In September 1957, Fred West bought himself a 98cc Bantam motorbike, registration number RVJ199, something to quicken the pace of country life, the dead life, the slow movement of time. So what we find in this and other representations, negative representations of country life, is rural communities not just being portrayed as being boring and isolated, but as being dysfunctional places. So I haven't put any quotes up here from this, but there's a lot, again, within this book, Happy Like Murderers, about the rural childhood of Fred West, and particularly about the rumours of child abuse and sexual abuse of animals, which were widespread, apparently, in communities like the one that Fred West grew up in the 1940s and 1950s. So these rural communities tend to get portrayed as places in which nothing happens, or terrible things happen in isolated, hidden away, remote places. Another dimension that's explored in these non-idyllic representations of the countryside is of rural labour and the rural economy. So rural labour here is represented very often as repetitive, monotonous, squalid, soul-destroying, industrialised, and often very cruel. So again, another example, this is from The Restraint of Beasts, that novel from Magnus Mills that I talked about. So this is the Scottish fence builders, Tam and Ritchie. This is them with their foreman, who's the narrator of the novel. They're in rural Herefordshire. They're living in a caravan as they do this fence building work in the middle of the countryside there. And this is them waking up one Saturday morning, hungover, with a day's fence building ahead of them. And it's this idea of the squalid, soul-destroying nature of rural labour. When I woke up the next morning, I realised that, like Tam and Ritchie, I didn't like working on Saturdays much either. My head was throbbing from the drink. Worse, there was rain falling on the caravan roof. To people who work outside all day, this is one of the most desolate sounds known. Rain can transform the most pleasant task into drudgery. The only reason we had managed to keep the job just about on schedule, more or less, was because the weather had stayed dry. Now we faced a muddy, soaking, wet struggle from the moment we went out in the morning until the end of the day. And of course, the squalor inside the caravan would reach new depths, with wet clothing hanging everywhere and mud on the floor. All we had to dry us off was the gas fire. I lay on my bed thinking about this and wondering how I was going to motivate Tam and Ritchie to get up. And another dimension of rural labour, and I think in the rural economy, I think this is something that speaks about the ways in which rural life has been transformed in recent years through modernisation and through globalisation, is when it talks about the more industrialised forms of rural labour. So extensive agriculture, for example, being the most obvious example. So this is excuse me, a quote from the 1994 novel What a Carve Up by the novelist Jonathan Coe. Now this is a very well regarded and critically successful political satire. The novel tells the story of a wealthy family called the Winshaw family. And it tells the story about how each of the children of the Winshaw family have risen to great power within British society. So one of them is an arms dealer, one of them is a right-wing politician, one of them is a right-wing newspaper columnist, and one of them, Dorothy Winshaw, has become the head of a massive agriculture business, and she's become incredibly rich on the back of this sort of intensive agricultural production and a complete disregard for animal rights. So this is kind of exposing rural labour and the rural economy, the more industrialised ends of it. And this is a section where it talks about the ways in which Dorothy Winshaw has developed these highly efficient forms of battery farming, and shows the real kind of cruel extent of some of this industrialized agriculture. Dorothy was a great believer in research and development, and over the years, the Brunwyn Group, that's her company, built up a reputation for technological innovation, particularly in chicken farming. These were some of the problems she'd set out to solve. 1, aggression. Dorothy's broilers, those are the chickens that she's farming, just before they go into the slaughter at 7 weeks old, roughly 1/50th of the way through their natural lifespan, were typically allotted a space of half a square foot per bird. Feather pecking and cannibalism were common amongst the birds held in such confinement. Solution. After experimenting with special red-tinted spectacles clipped onto the beak, so that by neutralizing the color, the bird would be prevented from pecking the red combs of its fellows, Dorothy replaced these with blinkers, which simply blocked off the vision to either side. When this also proved too cumbersome, she applied herself to finding the most effective method of de-beaking. At first it was done with a blowtorch, and then with a soldering iron. Finally, her designers came up with a small guillotine equipped with hot blades. It was reasonably efficient, except that if the blades were too hot, they caused blisters in the mouth. Also, since it was necessary to de-beak about 15 birds a minute, perfect accuracy was not always possible, and there were many cases of burned nostrils and facial mutilations. And it actually goes on and gets even more brutal than that. So I thought it probably wise to stop the quote at that point. So, as I say, one of the kind of values of these negative representations of the rural areas in Great Britain is the ways in which they talk about some of these changes that have affected the British countryside in recent decades: the industrialisation of agriculture, modernisation, the impacts of globalisation on the food chain, and those sorts of things. And these are things that are rarely talked about in any other representations of the British countryside. So for the last sort of few minutes, I'll just round up for the next sort of couple of minutes. I can see there's some questions that are coming through onto the comments. So I'll get to those in a second. Thank you for those who've entered those questions, and anyone's got any other questions, please feel free to add those, and I'll pick those up in a couple of minutes. So I want to draw some conclusions. So what I've argued is that there is a tendency for many people to think of the British countryside as this idyllic terrain, to think that the ways in which it's represented in images of all kinds in Britain is still overwhelmingly idyllic. What I would argue, though, is there's actually a very extensive post-Second World War tradition of non-idyllic representations of the British countryside, representations that portray the British countryside in resolutely non-idyllic, often very negative terms. And this has been largely overlooked in rural geography research. As I said before, there are some geographers who have acknowledged the existence of some negative rural imagery. But I think the research that I've done, which I published in the GA's journal Geography a year ago, is the first that tries to bring together all of these, or many of these, negative representations and look at them in their collective significance. And I think, importantly, these are some of the only representations of the British countryside that talk about the impacts of modernity and globalisation on the British countryside. For example, it's quite common for these to feature symbols of modernity. So Jonathan Coe's "What a Carve Up," that scene inside the barn with all the chickens getting their beaks chopped off. It's quite common for things like the Midwich Cuckoos to have a mysterious, or the Breakthrough, a kind of mysterious research facility in the countryside. Eden Lake, a very violent kind of horror film set in a seemingly idyllic, holiday setting in the countryside. Pylons that appear over the hillside, the first image of modernity. And as soon as the pylons appear running across the hillside, the apparently idyllic weekend away that the couple in the main characters in the film are going to enjoy suddenly starts going wrong. So they acknowledge that the British countryside has been changed by modernity and globalisation in recent times. Sometimes when people talk about negative images of the British countryside, they say that these images tend to show the countryside as a sort of previously innocent terrain that's been corrupted by outside forces. Actually, many of the negative representations that I've looked at have shown that it's not about the countryside being corrupted by outside forces, but has actually pointed the blame at characteristics or groups within the countryside as being part of this. So in What a Carve Up, Dorothy Winshaw is a member of a very historic, landed, aristocratic family. She is, and her family are of the countryside. They're not outsiders who've come from the town to corrupt the countryside. They are the countryside. And I think there's lots and lots of work, though, that can be done to further explore non-idyllic images of the British countryside. You can find earlier examples. I've talked only about post-Second World War, which is when these things tend to get more and more frequent. But you could think of things like Tessa the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. You could think of The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes novel. So there are earlier examples, and also international examples as well. So I'm just putting a few references up there that I've used within the presentation, mainly to the kind of the examples that I've talked about and quoted from within the presentation. And I'll just sort of leave this up here. This is a slide with some images of and information about the geography program that we deliver at the University of Winchester. So you can find out more information there. And certainly I talk to our geography students about these sorts of ideas, about the ways in which the countryside, I would argue, is represented in very negative terms, as well as the more positive terms that have been acknowledged in earlier research. So I'm going to finish there. I can see there's quite a few comments coming through on the chat here. So I'm just going to have a quick read of these, and I will just say a few things by way of responses to these questions that are coming through. And I'd say if any of you have got some further questions, please send them through, and I'll also respond to those. So I'll just have a quick sip of water, a quick read of the questions, and then see what I can say. So firstly, Kim, who I know, hello Kim, any thoughts on how COVID-19 pandemic may change the countryside idyll as there's more counter-urbanisation occurs, as well as staycations? I think, interestingly, Kim, what's happened in the last year with the pandemic is actually, if anything, showing something of a resurgence of the rural idyll. There's apparently been lots of instances, as I'm sure you're aware, of people trying to get away from cities, and a real valuing of green spaces, be they within cities or in the countryside beyond cities. So actually, ironically, I think the pandemic has, from what I've seen, caused an upsurge in interest in rural properties, an upsurge in interest in people leaving cities. Whether or not this is going to be a permanent change, I don't know. I suspect, and this is speculation, that once lockdowns end and once life gets a bit more back to normal, I think people are going to really miss those big urban experiences that we currently can't access. So I think there are going to be a number of kind of contrasting things coming out of this. I think there's going to be more interest in the countryside and an upsurge in that kind of idyllic image of the countryside. I do think that people aren't ready to abandon cities, though, just yet. Mia, would you say the rate of counter-urbanisation has grown in recent times due to the rural idyll? I think, Mia, certainly, I mean, the 1970s was called the decade of counter-urbanisation. And I think a lot of that was driven by a very idyllic image of the countryside. So lots of people left urban and suburban areas and moved into small towns and rural areas. So I think the rural idyll was a very powerful image in driving that. I think there is some evidence, though, that people's experience of moving to the countryside hasn't always been as positive as they might have expected. I've read some, I can't think of the reference I'm thinking of right now, but read some research that was done by people who moved in their kind of late 40s, 50s, or in retirement into the countryside. And they did talk about feelings of isolation and so on. Not universal, but undoubtedly, I think, Mia, that idea of the rural idyll that was historically very, very ingrained, drove that counter-urbanisation. Whether people, when they got to the countryside, lived up to their expectations, I don't think that was absolutely universal. Basak, thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you. Maybe our discontent with our lives, daily horror in cities, jobs, etc., makes us think the rural. I think Basak, you made an interesting point. I think if you think back to the 19th century, when the rural idyll first kind of really became very, very prominent within British culture, it was the horror of life in urban areas in the 19th century, the pollution, the industry, the noise, the disease, ironically, the overcrowding was what made people long for the countryside. So that's when you got very, very nostalgic representations of the countryside emerging. So very kind of chocolate box kind of paintings were very popular. Very nostalgic novels of country life were very popular. There were the famous music hall song called If It Wasn't for the Houses in Between. It's about a Cockney who lives in the East End in this grim back-to-back terrace, who dreams of the countryside beyond the city, who said, he could see it, he'd be able to see it and experience it if it wasn't for the houses in between. So certainly historically, Basak, that horror of urban life was what led the rural idyll to kind of emerge in the first place. So I mean, what's happening now, I don't know whether it's going to lead to a kind of resurgence in the rural idyll, or whether it's something that's just going to pass hopefully in many ways, pass very quickly. So Kim, again, is the idyll really just an urban image about living in a chocolate box cottage? I mean, the rural idyll is something an image of the countryside which does ignore, as you say, the reality of the countryside, the reality of working in the countryside, farming, low-paid jobs, etc. I mean, ironically, historically, the biggest concentrations of poverty in 19th century Britain were not the cities, but it was low-paid agricultural communities. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the reality of the countryside now includes, amongst many wonderful things, I'm not slacking off the countryside here. I enjoy cycling around Hampshire and the countryside. But the reality of the countryside includes things like poverty in some places, isolation for some, perhaps frustration for some young people growing up in the countryside, unaffordable housing, low-paid jobs, as you say, Kim. So yeah, there are lots of negative images of the aspects of countryside life, which typically are not represented within idyllic images, but they do tend to get represented in these non-idyllic images. So one that I haven't talked about, which many of you probably are familiar with, is the BBC comedy This Country, which is again set in a kind of idyllic Cotswold village, but it's the lives of two unemployed, disenfranchised young people, Kerry and Curtin, the cousins, and their mundane, boring lives stuck in this village when there's nothing for them to do. They can't get out because they can't drive, So it's actually in these non-idyllic images very often, even in comedy, where some quite serious issues get brought up. Basak, another question from you. Let me just read that. Yeah, so it's the same for the urban. In the last years, there's more interest in negative aspects of the city, so informal, illegal settlements and so on, such as favela tourism. Yeah, I think you're right, actually, Basak. I mean, there is a sort of I think that there's often long been a fascination with some of the darker sides of rural areas, but you're absolutely right. Things like favela tourism to places like kind of gang controlled areas in cities of the global south. So there is a sort of fascination with the darker sides of urban areas as well. I haven't talked about urban imagery at all, and again, if you look at urban imagery, again, there's positives and there's negatives. And I think, so maybe you're suggesting there a folk horror tour into the countryside. That's an intriguing, you could do tours of the locations, that places like where The Devil Rides Out and The Wicker Man were filmed. That might be another kind of possibility for rural tourism, a folk horror tour. Okay, thank you, Kim. Another couple of thought-provoking. Excellent. Thank you very much. Just shows how far-ranging geography is as a discipline. It certainly is. You study geography at university. You study an enormous range of things. Absolutely. So thank you, Kim. Thank you all for those questions. It's a couple of minutes. I guess if there's any more questions, another couple of minutes we could take. But some great questions coming through. So thank you all very much for those thoughts.
Yes, and this has been quite a thought-provoking talk, as Kim has said. There's a lot of things to think about, and I'm sure it opens up a lot of avenues of thought for people, not just thinking of geography as something, physical or human, but also adding in these aspects of media as a method of exploring different concepts of different places.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, we have got a couple of minutes left, so if anybody does want to add any more questions, please feel free to do so. But yes, it certainly struck a note with me, having grown up in the countryside, and the idea of people moving from the city to the countryside seems to be a very strong one. Especially over the past year, where people are finding that living in the city without all those extra activities is a little more grim than they were expecting, and trying to the countryside. But do you think, to some extent, also there's this, with this idyll idea, they don't expect the realities of the lack of infrastructure you get in the countryside as well, on a very practical level? Yeah,
I think so. Actually, it's interesting that quite a few of these, not so much the lack of infrastructure, but I think absolutely, to answer your question, yes, people do move to the countryside and get frustrated by the slow internet, the no buses, all of those kind of things. But interestingly, more generally, within quite a few of these kind of negative, non-idyllic representations that I've looked at, the theme of somebody going to the countryside expecting to find an idyllic retreat and not finding that crops up quite often. So Eden Lake, incredibly violent horror film, effectively, about a couple who are going away for the weekend to this idyllic little setting, and they get attacked effectively by this kind of horrific kind of gang that they encounter. So that, and also the film Straw Dogs in the 1970s, a mathematician and his wife, they go, he's on sabbatical, so he kind of goes to this remote Cornish farm cottage to work on his whatever it is he's working on, expecting peace and retreat, and then meets these incredibly hostile locals. So that kind of theme of reaching out for the rural idyll and not finding it is quite a common one within a lot of these representations, and does, I reckon, represent or echo that idea of the reality not living up to the expectations, definitely.
Yeah. Well, since we haven't got any more questions coming through on the chat, and we've just got to 5 o'clock, I think it's about time for us to say goodbye to our lovely audience. So thank you very much for your talk, Tim, today. Like I say, it's been really interesting to hear about what your interests are and to look a bit closer at the countryside. And for everybody that's still here and still watching, just to remind you that we've got another lecture coming up on Tuesday next week, so on the 30th, from Geo, on coastal environments, another environment which, is part of the rural idyll, I'd imagine.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so with that, we will say goodbye to everyone watching, and hopefully see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for watching. Thanks for your questions.